Hello, 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 beautiful people. For today, we have addiction as a disorder. So, if you're struggling with alcohol or drugs, few ways to pinpoint if you have the disorder, alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder, would be to just look at quantities. So, when you drink, how many do you have? If you do drugs, how much do you do? And there is a vast difference between somebody who has addiction and somebody who doesn't. So, if you just look percentage wise to keep the math simple, and it differs depending on substances and different drugs. But if I just keep it simple, I look at it like 10% of people kind of battle addiction, which means 90% of people don't. So if I just look at the 90% of people that don't first, it helps make sense of it. So if you take somebody who doesn't battle addiction and you give them alcohol, or you give them, most of them probably don't touch drugs recreationally, so that's kind of comical. Or you give them drugs, the quantities that they'll do is very, very few. And so that will be one way to sense if there's a difference for you. You know, when you drink or do drugs, how much do you do? If you have substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder, it's typical your quantities are elevated, you've built a tolerance to it, it's causing you probably problems in day-to-day living, it's difficult to moderate, and it's difficult to stop, even though you may be having negative consequences. And I think one of the issues is people that don't have addiction look at people that do. And so if I don't have addiction and I have the ability to control how much I drink or even stop, I now look at somebody battling addiction and I make the assumption that they should be able to do the same thing I'm doing, which again, it's a self-centered viewpoint. It's, look, I think you should be able to do this because I can do this. And I think what's missed in the equation is if somebody's battling addiction, they have a legitimate mental disorder, right? So there's a substance use disorder, there's an alcohol use disorder. Like the brain's just not functioning the same way as it would in an ordinary person not battling addiction. So to me, it looks like at the point of addiction, I've impaired my own brain. You could look at it like I've rewired certain aspects of it. One being, the frontal cortex, decision making. The next part being like the limbic system with dopamine, and I've been heavy on pleasure, 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 pleasure. The other one I think is the midbrain, where it's almost like I view alcohol or drugs from a survival perspective. Like I need it to breathe. And then if I shift to the limbic system, not only do I need it to breathe, it's going to make me feel better in the short term right now. So it looks like the brain is making the decision for me before I even get to show up to weigh pros and cons. I'm almost like in an autopilot, just moving back towards alcohol or drugs, which it seems to make sense to me. It's similar if you looked at like a depressed person. It's clear as day that when somebody goes into a depressive state, like they're not purposely doing that. It's almost like it appears to be being done to them. It looks the same from an addiction standpoint. If I'm battling it, like it looks like addiction showing back up while I'm sober, and it's driving me back to the alcohol or it's driving me back to the drugs, even though I sense I probably shouldn't do it or it's a bad idea. This complete inability to stop myself from touching it again. And I think it's the hardest concept to get people who struggle with it to understand, let alone people that don't battle it. So I think looking at it like it's a mental disorder helps a lot of people understand, like, okay, this person's not like a bad person, they're not a terrible person. They have a legitimate disorder that if they're not treating the disorder, and that's another interesting piece to me. You could look at alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder, and I'm treating it at the point I'm drinking or doing drugs. It's treating the disorder. When I now get sober, I'm not treating it anymore. And so the natural assumption is the longer I stay sober, the better I'm getting. And from my point of view, it actually looks the opposite of that. It doesn't look like the longer I stay sober, the better I'm getting. It looks like the longer I'm sober, I'm not treating the disorder. Therefore, it looks like I'm getting worse from an internal perspective. But I think the viewpoint is the longer I can go without drinking or doing drugs, the better I'm doing. And it looks like that's why people go back to it. I'm not treating it, and therefore I'm driven back to do it again. So I think the better approach would be, I have a substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder. The moment I stop drinking and doing drugs, I'm not treating it anymore. I have to find something else to treat it, or the brain kind of leads me back to alcohol or drugs to treat it again. So the idea seems to be a game against time. Before this thing circles back around and I do drugs and alcohol again, how many tools can I pick up to start treating it to kind of protect myself? That's all I got, though. Have a good day, guys.